each day we have a wonderful bioethics honors students presenting, acting as a moderator, who's going to present you and read your bio. So she'll read your bio, Dr. Dennis Cooley, and then you present, and then she'll read the bio for Dr. Nichole Phillips, and then you will present, and then she will ask the questions that's in the Q&A. This is Cierra Cross. She is my heart goes out to her. I love my students. And God knows I love these young people, but my heart is broken for Cierra. Here's why. To get to the internship at the CDC for the summer, a paid internship, you have to go through a whole lot of students to get there. And she achieved that level, and then COVID shut it down. And so, so that broke my heart, because again, for her to achieve that level, that tells you the level of importance. So she's on the leadership team of the Bioethics Honors Program, and that just says a lot about how her mind works. Her mind is nonstop. So now, Cierra, I turn it over to you. We so appreciate your presence, and please introduce to us Dr. Dennis Cooley.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Dennis Cooley received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Rochester in 1995. His teaching and research interests include theoretical and applied ethics with a focus on pragmatism, bioethics, business ethics, personhood, and death and dying. He is the author of Technology, Transgenics, and a Practical Moral Code, Dust Values and Obligations, a Pragmatic Framework, and co-edited Passing Out, Identity Veiled and Revealed. He is the editor of Springer's International Library of Bioethics, associate editors of Elsevier's Ethics, Medicine, and Public Health, and director of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute, which focuses on applied ethical and social issues affecting the Northern Plains and beyond. So I present to you guys Dr. Dennis R. Cooley.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And what I'm going to do is run the PowerPoint, but I want to thank Dr. Hodge, Dr. Phillips, Dr. Warren for inviting me and being willing to talk about what I'm going to be discussing in a minute. So I am very bad at computers, so I'm going to try to share my screen. And let's see, it's this one. Do we all see that? Oh, great. Well, the US Census, of course, is an important thing, but a lot of folks don't realize what it can be used for and what it has been used for over time. So when we're talking about vulnerable and susceptible communities, part of the reason that they're vulnerable and susceptible is because of the misuse of the census. The census itself, a lot of folks think it's just a head count, when it never was just a head count. And the way it's used, of course, is for resources to be invested in communities. So if you don't have accurate readings of a community, that is, you don't really understand those who are susceptible or vulnerable in those communities, you can't do a good job investing the census and the problems with the current one, and then approaches on how to try to fix it so that it works better to address vulnerability and susceptibility, not only in healthcare, but in all avenues of life. So this is, of course, the preamble to the Constitution. And what I think with this, I'm going to start and end this. I'm going to move my screen over here with this because of the importance of it. I consider this to be the document on how to evaluate whether or not we've been successful with our investment in the community in regards to vulnerability and susceptibility. So it just says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Sometimes a barrier, sometimes as a tool to address disparities. For example, it's a barrier if the assumption is that everyone has equal power in all interactions when that is clearly untrue. There are groups who have historically been treated in such ways that they have become vulnerable or even to the level of susceptibility, as Dr. Warren defines that term. It can be a huge help if the Constitution is used to address those power disparities so that the privileged powerful are not allowed to act detrimentally towards the more vulnerable. That is, the Constitution is used to keep powerful people from exploiting. And more importantly, I think it enables the more vulnerable to attain more power, especially over their flourishing. This is also from the Constitution. This is directly on the census. It talks about it. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of persons, including those bound to service for a term of years and excluding Indians, not taxed, 3/5 for all other persons. So the 3/5, all of us know what that means. This has 3 races in it. It's talking about Native Americans, about Black people, African Americans, and about whites. So the census was never really about merely counting heads. It instilled racial categories in the actual counts itself. And by the way, the racial categories, I argue, in other places were to keep the different races separate, and more importantly, for the folks doing it in their minds, to make sure whites were pure. These racial classifications really start taking off in 1735 with Carl Linnaeus. He comes up with the racial categories of Americans, Asiaticus, Africanus, and Europaeus. I don't know how to pronounce that quite well, but you see how it goes. Native Americans, Asians, Africans, Europeans. And after that, Linnaeus did not rank them according to value, but of course, what automatically started happening was they were started to be ranked with Africanus as the lowest category. The census incorporated the 3 races I just mentioned, and until the 1960s, the census was used to discriminate against vulnerable people. It was to keep people separate and also to favor whites over all other races, which is why when we talk about some of these disparities, they were built up over a long period of time. Since then, since the 1960s, it is now used to measure the impact of discrimination. So it's been turned on its head to see how these different groups are able to flourish within the society. Some of the just outright abuses of the census data, for example, occurred in World War II when the FBI used it to figure out who was Japanese or Japanese American, German American, Italian Americans, and they interred them in camps. In 1970, it was used to disenfranchise African Americans by underreporting them. Now, why is that a big deal? Because if you're underreported, you don't get as much funding. Only 2% of European Americans were underreported. So that's a huge disparity between those 2 groups. And of course, the more recent issues with the Trump administration trying to include a citizenship question to try to tamp down on people using the census and then having underreporting. There was a presidential memorandum and all of these other things. I added on top of this, those were intentional. COVID itself caused its problems with the census, and whether or not we will have an adequate count is still going to be up in the air for some time to come, especially since one of the courts allowed for a premature ending of the census. The census was looking at the 1-drop rule. And in the US, it is any blood that is not white that makes the person that race. The Census Bureau itself, since 2013, has continuously declared that a majority of babies born in the United States are non-white. They give 2040 as or 2050 as the date in which there will be no majority population. But what they're doing is actually using the 1-drop rule. They're counting any mixed origin baby as non-white. In reality, as Alba has found, more than 50% of US babies have a non-Hispanic white mother. So they're biracial or multiracial children. The notion that they're non-white is false. In Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, by the way, the 1 drop rule actually is turned on its head. If you have 1 drop of white blood in your ancestry, that makes you white. Now, why does this matter? Because self-reporting, people report what they identify with. And if they identify one way, the numbers come in that can skew towards that particular group as the numbers increase. There are race questions that exclude groups. And of course, I take it as a given that the race is a social construct. It is based on things we perceive a lot of the time and on a lot of biases, but it's a social construct. It's not a biological fact. So we have on our current race questions, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native, Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and white. Missing from this, and these groups rightly are concerned that they're not being counted, are Hispanics, Latinx, and people from the Middle East and North Africa. There's been a skewing in regards to how the numbers have been reported, which of course throws off, again, the ability to invest, to know how things are working out, so you can invest your money to eliminate barriers, to help with people with not only healthcare, but jobs and all of the other things attached to adequate healthcare. In the 1960s, it was a money-saving move. The census went from enumerators, where people would go to houses, to self-identification, because then you let people identify themselves. You don't have to pay these enumerators to go around. When the enumerators were going around, they did not ask questions about race. It was considered to be inappropriate to do so. So what they did was they just looked at the individuals and they wrote down what they thought that person's race was. And what we saw there is, well, how we are seen by others, of course, is part of discrimination. We usually don't discriminate against ourselves. In fact, that would be very strange. Others discriminate against us, and part of that is how they view us. So what was happening here was discrimination was being put right into the census itself. American Indians were drastically undercounted because people didn't see that race. And so they wasn't being reported by the enumerators. And then there were all sorts of categories with how, if you were Black or African American, how much you were. When we went to self-reports, this is how we identify ourselves. And it's an important factor because this is how we value ourselves, how we want to be valued, and how we want to be recognized. But how we view ourselves is often not the same thing as how others view us. And so the numbers between these shifts actually threw off the census significantly. There's this really bizarre thing that's happened recently. I'm not sure if anybody has done this before, but there's this DNA testing. I always tell my students, don't ever do that. The reason why is once you have the DNA test done, they actually own the information about your DNA. And they can do whatever they want with it. It's not a medical, HIPAA does not apply to these particular folks. So they can do whatever they want. But with the DNA testing, people have found out that they have ancestors who might have belonged to a group that is vulnerable or has been systematically oppressed. Now, the person who has found this out doesn't appear in any way, shape, or form as a member of this race. So it's usually about white people, and Gupta talks about this, about it being uniquely white privilege, where an individual who has never been discriminated against, never will be discriminated against, never had any of that impact in their life, will claim membership in a group that actually has suffered from that. And so how do the numbers get skewed? Because now they think this person who is very privileged, who has a lot of wealth and opportunities others are denied, that now is figured into the group that is oppressed, that is vulnerable, that is susceptible. So it throws the numbers off, and therefore not as much money goes to those groups as they need. The problems continue with the combining of ethnic and versus racial categories, the combined civil status with culture. It inconsistently uses subcategories. It's basically not well done to take care of those who need the help or need the investment. There are a variety of other problems. I'll look at this one at the bottom. There's a low reliability of ethno-racial statistics across settings and over time when compared to other populations characteristics measured by the census, which play havoc with trend lines. Now, why is that the case? If you don't know the situation, you can't adequately invest in healthcare and other necessary areas, because the numbers are not, the data are not giving you what you need to know. So why does this matter? Because it harms the vulnerable and the susceptible. Being a bioethicist and a philosopher, we always have to define our terms. And so I tried to define moral susceptibility, and I used the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society's definition as my base. But the idea is about power. People are vulnerable because they don't have enough power in particular areas. If we're and this looks very very scholastic. It looks like a math problem, but what I wanted to do was to try to clarify it in my head as much as possible. So a person P is vulnerable to another's use of power on that individual, on P, in P's environment over a period if the definition, we've got an intrinsically valuable being, there's an aspect that person has that can be harmed. And that aspect is essential to the person's flourishing, doing well in that environment, being competitive, collaborative, having a good life. P has insufficient power to withstand that use of power, and that use of power will either objectively or subjectively harm that person's ability to flourish. Now, objectively, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it could eliminate one of those, or prevent the person from satisfying one of those, which would be objective harm. There's also subjective harm. People get to value their lives themselves and what they mean and whether or not they're going well. So this could also interfere with how a person views herself. And P is, the final one is P can't do much about it, that she can't fully mitigate the harm that's being done to her. Now, if you can fully mitigate it, you're not vulnerable, you actually have an enormous amount of power. Vulnerable people, I'm using Professor Warren's definition here because I think this is a category of folks who are vulnerable, but to a degree in which they are extraordinarily fragile. And by the way, I want to be careful here because I never want to assume a group of folks don't have power. Every person has power, it's just in different ways. But these individuals, I think Professor Warren's definition works beautifully here. They're vulnerable because of being habitually underserved. So it's a long period of being made vulnerable from outside sources. This has lasted a long time, and it's likely to last for a long time to come. Their historic vulnerability over time has made her, and I'm quoting him, deeply variably and selectively vulnerable in specific circumstances, a state of destitution that needs to be addressed with sensitivity to and rejection of harm the individuals are prone to. So there's a special duty here for people working to be especially careful and to design their interventions and interactions in a way that that person needs. Now, vulnerability comes in a lot of forms. It applies to all existing things. There are degrees, there are types. It can last for periods of time. So there can be an enormous number of ways an individual can be vulnerable. We look at individual vulnerability and susceptibility and group vulnerability and susceptibility. So for groups, we usually classify them based on age, race, ethnicity, health, chronic or terminal health issues, gender, disability, sex and pregnancy, developing world versus developed world, poverty, people confined to institutions, and there's a number of them that's in various documents. And then of course the individual themselves, individuals are different from groups, they have their own susceptibilities and vulnerabilities. So what should we do about this? How should the census be fixed So it actually can address vulnerability and susceptibility in a way that gets people to that goal outlined in the Constitution. Well, first thing we need to do is treat people the same when they are morally alike. That's just, this is Aristotelian common sense and common sense for all people. But you can't treat people the same all the time. Now, there's always this discussion of race blindness, color blindness, color consciousness. Sometimes color consciousness is appropriate, as Boxall has argued. Sometimes it isn't. If you have a group of folks the census shows have been discriminated against and are in vulnerable positions where other people are not, that's a moral difference that requires color consciousness and an intervention or interactions that would be different for people who are privileged. We also have to recognize the massive cultural and historical differences between these races and these groups. Vine Deloria Jr., for example, drew attention to the illicit merging of Black and Indian civil rights in the United States. And he's right. What happened to African-American people, Black people and African-American people, was different from what happened to Indigenous people. So Deloria delineates it this way. African-American people were excluded from white society and treated as less than human, less than persons. And that was part of the exclusion. That's part of the what occurred. And that had its own impact. With Indigenous people, what happened was their culture was assimilated into the white culture, completely eliminated with the schools. There were Indian schools in which they took children away from their parents and tried to teach them how to be white. But they were never fully white. They were never, so there was this, in this schizophrenic zone, basically. So what we have to do if we want to address problems with these groups or to recognize them and find them is we have to look at the history to understand what happened, why it happened, and what the impact is. One of the things we have to avoid doing is labeling entire category populations as vulnerable, because that's disrespectful and harmful of their members. So we have something called hedgehog thinking, in which everything's a binary. It's this or that. But groups of people are not binaries. They have multiple existences. They have multiple properties. They're individuals. We can make general classifications, but we have to be very careful not to do the stereotyping. In part, and I have 3 quotations here, and I'll do the De Bruin. Regulation should not classify entire groups as being categorically vulnerable, in part because doing so is demeaning and patronizing. So again, recognizing the complexity of the situation and the people involved. What we need to do also is, with vulnerability and susceptibility, what are the root causes of it? And to do this, one of the things we have to do is not to go with the framework that's most comfortable with us or the one that we perceive the world with, because that framework is limited to one particular person. Now, Professor Hodge wears glasses, and so do I. Our glasses, I assume, are not interchangeable, that we would be struggling, but we both perceive the world. And we perceive there's, as he has shown me, we can have understanding. We might not know each other, know what's going on with their experiences, but we can at least understand. So the idea is the diversity has to come through so you fully understand the complexity of the issues. That, in this way, you can identify the actual disease and deal with that rather than the symptoms. We have to create plausible and practical process that will build respect for vulnerable people, not treating vulnerable people as if they are the other or children, but instead as people facing barriers that should be eliminated. We should not have their neediest relieved, but provide opportunity, liberate talents, and then have fair social access so that anyone can function fully as the individuals and community citizens they are. We have to recognize situational nuance, such as an integrated theoretical model that describes the potential interactions between different factors or variables, and to use this model alongside the known correlates of use to help guide the development. And I think I'm getting late. One of the big things Dr. Hodge, sorry, I call him by his first name because that's usually what I do when I'm talking with him, is intersectionalities. and their impact. So intersectionality, as everyone knows, is you have multiple properties, all of us do. So if you have two that are make folks vulnerable, what usually is said is that they stack on top of each other. I don't particularly like that idea. I actually think that they might feed on each other and make the situation far worse than a stack would allow. So we have to look at the situation, understand how the vulnerability actually works. I'll just leave the intervention alone. Part of this would be looking at diversity as a language and making sure that everybody involved in the census and how it's formulated is literate or fluent in this language so that they can actually hear what's being said. Again, this is based on Professor Warren's research on community-based participatory research. We require census stakeholders develop their understanding, empathy, and so on by becoming acclimated, understanding. And then finally, here we get to the questions. What do we do? One of the suggestions is use less of the 18th century's primary race business, which are just social constructs in the first place. The only reason we want to keep that, by the way, is there are two groups that actually benefit from that: American Indians, African Americans, because we could track that and understand whether or not, or how they're doing in regards to discrimination in society. So that needs to be kept, a lot of folks would say, and then we want to use variability and diversity measurements based on national origin and linguistic differences, things that actually make sense. We could ask what population group rather than what racial group we belong to. Again, that would be when the Constitution, when we really are equal, and color blindness is appropriate over color consciousness, but that's not actually what the situation is that we're in now. What we should be doing is making our questions reflect identity and discrimination. So discrimination, we find out how well the different groups, large and small, are doing. Usually that we'll be talking about race. Identity, ask people how they identify themselves. These would be the partial questions. These are given by Pruitt. So they're at least a starting block for us to start talking about. And again, the way we know we're done and that we've been successful is if we can read this and say, yes, everyone, regardless of their origin, their ethnicity, their race, gender, sex, any of these characteristics could say, yep, that's who we are. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you. Okay, I got to exit. So how do I stop sharing screen? What do I do here?
There you go.
Okay.
All right, Cierra?
Yes. Alrighty. So next we have Dr. Nichole Phillips. Dr. Nichole Phillips is Associate Professor in the Practice of Sociology of Religion and Culture and the Director of Black Church Studies at Chandler School of Theology, Emory University. A sociologist of religion and public theologian, she teaches courses in community and congregational studies. Her research interests lie at the intersection of religion and American public life, with a focus on community and congregational studies, where she investigates the moral commitments and vision of community and congregational members. Her scholarship treats religion, critical race, gender, and cultural memory studies. She is also developing new research interests in the sociology of science and religion. Her first monograph, Patriotism, Black and White, The Color of American Exceptionalism, is a study of Black and whites in a rural Southern community and their shifting interpretations of American national identity and U.S. exceptionalism, with the election of Barack Obama as America's first president of African descent and at the height of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The volume further considers the implication of these patriotic and exceptionalist meanings under the present Trump administration. In 2019, Patriotism, Black and White landed on the bestsellers list for the Christian Ecumenical and flagship magazine of U.S. mainline Protestants, The Christian Century. Nichole also contributed a chapter to the published collection, Revives My Soul Again, The Spirituality of Martin Luther King Jr., which commemorated the 50th year anniversary of the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Her chapter explains the ways in which King Jr.'s spirituality animated his delivery of I Have a Dream and inspired his re-articulation of American national identity at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. The Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in Religion and the Humanities, Nichole was the first fellow in Emory University's Mellon Foundation Humanistic Inquiry Program to be appointed at the professional school. She is a senior faculty fellow at Emory University Center for Ethics and an associate faculty in the Emory's Department of Sociology. She received the AB from Wesley College, an MDiv from Harvard University's Divinity School, and an MA and PhD in religion, psychology, and culture with a minor in anthropology of religion from Vanderbilt University.
Thank you so much, Cierra. Thank you for introducing me. I appreciate it. I'd like to thank Dr. Warren and Dr. Hodge for inviting me to respond to Dr. Cooley's presentation, as well as I would like to say hello to my senior emeritus colleague, Dr. Randall Bailey, and to thank Ashante Ali Davis, as well as Ms. Katina Griffins for coordinating all of this weekend and sending out the information for the webinar, and to say hello to Attorney Monica. So my presentation in many respects will reflect what Dr. Cooley says, but in a different way. I launched from the perspective of his question in his presentation, why does this matter? And so I'm going to share my screen now. Where is it? No. 1 second.
Dr. Phillips, it should be at the bottom of the window where it says share screen.
Yes, I was looking for my presentation.
Oh.
Thank you. All right. So my presentation, in response to Dr. Cooley's presentation, is entitled "The Politics of Race, the U.S. Nation, and Ethics of Vulnerability." And of course, it is informed not just by the work that I've done in American civil religion and my book, Patriotism, Black and White, the Color of American Exceptionalism, but at the intersection of sociology of race and religion. So the politics of race, the US nation, and ethics of vulnerability. Race matters, but why? I'll do a brief overview of how race has been treated at the intersection of science and religion from the 19th century to the 21st century.
Dr. Phillips, can you click on slideshow so it will expand?
Okay.
Yeah, to your right. Yeah, exactly, right there.
Okay.
There you go. Thank you very much.
Sure. As we know, and this is always debated, but race has been a component of evolutionary development. And why do I say that? I say that because race is a category that in many respects starts out as value neutral. So race is like the fact that our necks support our heads and is connected to the rest of our bodies. So with respect to that, scientifically, race is value neutral and has been a component of evolutionary development. Yet, race has been used with respect to scientific racism. So for instance, Dr. Samuel Morton's cranial studies were tied to intelligence, and that occurred during the 1830s and the 1840s. And essentially, and in brief, his cranial studies suggested that the larger the cranium, the more intelligent the social or cultural group. So respecting race, European Americans, white people were more intelligent than Blacks and people of color who had smaller craniums. Let us look at Dr. J. Marion Sims's work, who is the father of modern gynecology. And his work occurred in the 1840s. As the father of modern gynecology, he remains a controversial figure because of the ethics around his studies, the ethics around conducting studies on enslaved women, a vulnerable population, though we have our modern day surgical, gynecological surgical techniques on repairing the fistula, as well as the tools that are used by modern doctors when women go in for their exams. Yet, based on his studies, questions of ethics comes up because his studies were conducted on Black women's bodies and enslaved Black women's bodies. We're here because we're commemorating Tuskegee, the Tuskegee Experiment, a 40-year study of untreated syphilis in Black men. And of course, there's always fact and fiction around this. So the fiction that the US Public Health Service gave these Black men syphilis is not true. They had syphilis, but it remained untreated. And the studies occurred between 1932 and 1972. And the men were told that the studies were being done on bad blood, or on them having bad blood. The ethics around this vulnerable population, because they were not being treated for the illness that they had, but more importantly, they weren't informed. And so this is where informed consent comes in. They weren't informed about the fact that they were part of experimental studies. And then we think about social Darwinism and eugenics studies, and that goes from the late 1800s, and I bring it all the way up to the late 20th century. Why? Because Darwinism, in terms of scientific concept, is about natural selection. So we often talk about it in terms of survival of the fittest, but this social Darwinism, which is often connected to eugenic studies, becomes a type of scientific racism because of this encouraging the reproduction of desirable traits and the discouraging of undesirable traits. So those who have undesirable traits are Black and people of color, and those who have desirable traits are white. And I say that the studies even go up into the late 20th century, because I think about in the early 1990s, the publication of the text, The Bell Curve. And the Bell Curve documenting this connection between race and intelligence. And once again, a hierarchy being established based on race, and race mattering, and bringing into question how race was treated scientifically. And then we can think about the treatment of race religiously. So race being a sign of God's pleasure and displeasure. And so for instance, even today, although it might not be as prominent, but even today, this question about the cursing of Ham, one of Noah's son. And so this cursing of Ham making or causing Black people to be hewers of water, in other words, hewers of the soil. In other words, those a social and a cultural group fated to be enslaved and to always work the land. So race matters because of the value that is often placed on this concept. Race matters, but why? Well, I gave a brief history and overview, and let's go into the fact that race can be problematic and controversial because of the social hierarchies or racial hierarchies that are established, which usually establish, as I've stated before, superior and inferior social groups. Race matters because of when we think about the political sphere, and more recently, where I'm thinking about Columbus Day and this move to change Columbus Day, named after the Italian and European explorer Christopher Columbus, to Indigenous Peoples Day in honor of Native Americans who were socially and physically displaced from the Americas and faced near genocide through violence and plunder. Race matters because of economic tensions and contentions, such as the enslavement of Blacks for use as labor, which built the strength of, and this is always debatable, which for me, I never understand why, but it's always debatable about the enslavement of Blacks building the strength of the US economy, or the internment of the Japanese, or Latinos, and under our present administration, US immigration policies, and even right now, this push to reunite the 500 children who were separated from their parents with respect to the incoming new administration. So race matters because of the value that's placed on race, because it's not just this evolutionary concept and the development of social hierarchies, how it works in the political sphere, as well as around economic tensions and contentions. Race matters. We often understand and look at race as a social concept. What does that mean? The concept of race is given meaning based on social relations and historical context. In other words, it implies that racial meanings vary tremendously over time, i.e. history, and between different societies, and conform to demands of place. So the way in which we, or our racial categories in America is different than in in countries, and I'm thinking particularly in Brazil, which has different racial categories, as well as I'm also thinking of South Africa, which has racial categories of white and Black and colored, etc. So how we understand race is often based from our particular social context and based on our social relationships, but it works differently, and racial categories work differently throughout the world. And so it is difficult, or it should be difficult and challenging to overlay our racial categorizations on other societies and other countries. the recognition is that race is a variable because it is shaped by social forces, historical forces, social forces, political forces, economic forces, etc. Let's talk about US Race Matters. How race is defined within the US is that it is contested by the collective, but also by individuals in person and practice. Racial categories are formed, transformed, destroyed, and reformed. Formed, transformed, destroyed, and reformed, producing what sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winant terms racial formation. So let's stop for a minute. How can race be formed, transformed, destroyed, and reformed? Because we often, it's not intuitive that race, and especially in a US context, it is not intuitive that race is formed, transformed, destroyed, and reformed. But that is where the US Census comes in. And I think it's interesting that in 2020's US Census that closed in October, because of COVID-19 and by Supreme Court mandate, that the purely racial category of Black was then delineated. In other words, Black people, instead of the category being Black/African American, in this census, Black people could identify according to ethnicity. And previously, with respect to censuses, the purely racial category was often ascribed to Black people. And then Latinos were often purely ascribed ethnic categorization. And so within the ethnic categorization, then you could describe yourself according to race. And then with respect to Native Americans, that really wasn't a purely racial category because it is always and often tied to some type, their community affiliation. So what tribe do you belong to? Where do you live? What reservation? So with respect to this, racial categories and the examples that I've just given you, racial categories are formed, transformed, destroyed, and reformed. And even now, we have multiracial categories, and that wasn't the case in 1790 when the census, when we saw our first census, which was to distinguish between white men and people of color, i.e. those who were Black. So Omi and Renat describe this racial categorization of being formed, transformed, destroyed, and reformed as racial formation. And they inform my thinking about how US race matters. As we continue into this US race matters, so US race matters, as well as the ways in which race matters in the US, a theory of racial formation refers to the process by which, and this is what I said before, race being shaped by social forces, historical, social, economic, political, and other forces determine the content of racial categories and the importance of racial meanings. And we often say, race is socially constructed. Another way of saying race is a social concept. Another way of saying that the social construction of race is based on social relationships and historical paradigm. Race is always at the axis of pivot to social relations. As we continue with this theory of racial formation, we had the racial identity, and now we look at racial ideology. Racial ideology becomes the rules for classification of other groups when compared to a person's own racial group and identity, which offers a commonsensical way for understanding, explaining, and acting in the world. So a theory of racial formation also considers racial identity and the construction of race, who I am, and racial ideology, who others say I am. So with respect to this, race is a master category in the US because the concept is fundamental to, has shaped, and continues to influence US history, politics, economics, and culture. In other words, all spheres of American life. Race is political. However, and this is where Dr. Cooley, and this is a different way of saying it, but he brought it up in his lecture. Race does not, even though race is a master category in the US, it does not transcend, it does not work above or separately from other social indicators, or what we would say are co-constituencies of inequality and difference or marginalizations. It does not transcend gender. It does not transcend class. It does not transcend sexual orientation or age or other co-constituencies or other ways to identify marginalizations or inequality. So race is co-constituent with these markers, these social indicators of difference. Race is political, and we live in a racial state. And that's why in the US, race matters. So I want to focus specifically on not just the fact that the census has and can discriminate, but I want to look at the census with respect to race being political and us living in a racial state. So when we think about racial politics in a theory of racial formation, Omian Winant says, across the political spectrum, contestation takes place between the state and civil society with respect to defining and redefining race. The state wields enormous power, and Dr. Cooley brought up this power in relationship to vulnerability. The state wields enormous power in defining what race is through its potential, through its powers of classification. The state fundamentally shapes one's social status, access to economic opportunities, political rights, and indeed one's identity itself. And so with respect to the politics of race and matters of census data, state designation of racial categories, meaning the political dimensions of state assignment of racial identity, continue to provoke disputes in the US because census categories are routinely and strategically deployed to circumscribe the political, economic, and social rights of people of color and immigrants. So census data and the matter of census data is not just about individual and group identity, but it is about how the state operates in designating racial categories. And the way the state operates, our nation state operates in terms of designating categories, it has particular impact on Black people and people of color because of this political, economic, and social rights of people of color and immigrants always being held in balance. So the problem with this matters of census data is that there is this consistent and enduring divide or chasm between state categorizations of race and individual and group self-identifications. So what is an example of that? The fact that Arab Americans are identified as white, but many Arab Americans contest the designation because that's a state designation of the categorization of being white. Why? Because some would say we are coming out of the war on terror, yet terrorism still exists. And so because of the war on terror, many Arab Americans are discriminated against because of this religiously identified or religiously oriented issue. And so that means that if they are designated as white, then their racial issues are rendered invisible. And so the problem with matters of census data come in with this divide between state categorizations of race and individual and group self-identifications. And as well, it reinforces a nation-based paradigm of race. Race matters because, and I quote, when a or any society allocates differential economic, political, social, and psychological rewards to groups along racial lines, and when the social construction of race reveals and reproduces racial hierarchies, inequities, and divisions that are often hidden, systemic, institutional, avoided, and invisible to most whites, race matters. It matters when society allocates differential, not just treatment, because when we think about discrimination, we're thinking just about treatment, but I want us to think systemically. When any society allocates differential economic, political, social, and psychological rewards, i.e., we are operating in systems, race matters. And it points to the fact that we live in a racial state, race is political, and reinforces this nation-based paradigm of race. And so, I conclude with the US racial state. If we're thinking about matters of the census, and if we're thinking about US race matters, and if we're thinking about the ways in which race matters, it comes down to the despotic and democratic dimensions of our nation state. That, and I think about the Tuskegee Experiment with respect to the despotic dimension of our racial state. The despotic dimension of a racial state refers to domination, dispossession, violence, confinement, coerced labor, exclusion, denial of rights and due process, and deprivation of life, liberty, or land, which has been state practices as long as the United States has existed, and the use of particular bodies like Black bodies in experimentation, or now we see with how can I talk about race mattering and US race matters without talking about the triple pandemic that we're in, one of which was and the continual protests against police brutality. So the ways in which state violence is used against particular bodies point to the despotic dimensions of our US racial state. But the despotic dimensions are always counterbalanced by democratic dimensions of a US racial state. The democratic dimension is for the politics of race in America are communicated by democratic projects and practices that include freedom dreams, like Martin Luther King Jr.'s now famous 1963 Dream speech delivered at the March on Washington, social movements to resist domination, non-compliance of social and cultural groups with unjust laws, alternate ways of conceiving group and individual identities, and the display of racial and social solidarity in the presence of the despotic. And the domestic and local Black Lives Matter movement that became global, for me, is a reflection of the democratic dimension of the US racial state, because this global dimension became a display of racial and social solidarity in the presence of the despotic. Thank you.
Dr. Cooley, Dr. Phillips, you all have clearly outlined so much. And while Cierra Cross, Ms. Cross, while she juggles the questions in the question and answer space, Ms. Cross, and there are also questions in the chat room, because there were panelists who were unable to ask questions in the Q&A, so they had to put it in the chat room. So you could juggle those. But while you're doing that juggling to see which question you're going to ask Ms. Cross, I just want to make a comment and ask a question, because Dr. Cooley, Dr. Phillips, the picture you painted, both of you, in terms of essentially both of you spelled out the politics of race and the politics of race in the census. That scares the hell out of me, because just to quote something, paraphrase something that Dr. Phillips said, and that is that states shapes racial identity, and that is the complexity of how the whole corpus comes together. It creates a complicated system, and it lends itself to some of the questions that are going to be asked, actually, to where is it pigmentation or is it identification? You know, the one of the things Dr. Bailey asked is, while he was living in South Africa, and you all raised a point, he said, why do you identify as Black? You could identify as colored. And we know in America, colored is not embraced anymore, but that was an identification thrust upon us. And then there was Negro. So you have these shifts and these internal shifts. And so it's hard to really kind of lock down what we're talking about. So I just consider myself a Black man, a brother, you know, a brother. That just makes it really simple for me. And it's almost necessary for me, because most of my siblings were born in St. Kitts in the West Indies, and therefore they're not African American, but definitely Black, right? So we have these kinds of almost like a game playing. So having said that, in the final slide, Dr. Phillips, you put side by side the despotic, I think it was the despotic versus the democratic, correct? It was despotic versus democratic. All right. And Dr. Cooley, you could jump in here on this one too. I am absolutely concerned by how these lines of demarcation have been drawn and redrawn with the Trump administration. It is now so difficult to identify. It almost like takes us back 50 years. You know, Langston Hughes wrote a book called "Fooling Our Black Folks," right? Fooling our white folks, where people who light complexion blacks opted to be white because it's easier than to have been black. So with all of this going on, is the question of race and how to fit. How do I fit in censorship? Which box do I check? It becomes extremely complicated. And especially, Dr. Phillips, use the term essentialism. Can you explain what the word essentialism means? And then tell us, both Dr. Phillips and Dr. Cooley, how are we supposed to understand essentialism with respect to this day and age, where it's just, we're all over the place, what it means to be black, what it means to be white, and so on and so forth. So the politics of race shaped by the state and they combined with essentialism, how does it all play out?
Well, I would say that even though we recognize multicultural identity, that we are still shaped by this concept of hypo descent, i.e., what Dr. Cooley talked about in terms of the one drop of black blood, right? The one drop of black blood still, in many respects, dictates racial identification in the U.S., which I presented as, and like I said, informed by Omi and Wanat, this theory of racial formation is a combination of racial identity, who I say I am, and racial ideology, who others say I am. And so, racial formation and this one drop rule still in many respects reigns supreme. Now, it might have morphed in a different way, but I don't put it I can't put it past us, because questions of our first president of African descent being biracial, as well as our first vice president of African descent being biracial, is a thorn and is an issue for some Black people, because it not only points to colorism, but also it points to state classification of racial identity. I find it interesting. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, I always say Kamala, but Kamala Harris, she identifies as a Black woman, which doesn't render her Southeast Asian mother invisible, but because of the state identification of race, in articles and so on and so forth, she's being identified as both Black and Southeast Asian or Indian. And I don't have any issues with that, but I take note of it because we still are under this hypo descent, one drop of Black blood makes you Black, as well as state categorizations of race. And so the highlighting of the fact that she is biracial, which, as I stated before, when state categorizations of race and individual and social group categorizations of race come into play, it becomes problematic. There's contestation, and the contestation is happening amongst Black people. And I don't know what the percentage is, but I listen to the conversations. I listen to the conversations amongst my students. Like, why is it that the first president of African descent had to be biracial, or the first vice president woman of African descent had to be biracial? Could they not have been African American and hail from, you know, this kind of slave, you know, U.S. enslavement heritage and history?
Just before Dr. Cooley go, I just want to make this one little comment. It's so important what you're saying, because part of the conversation that was in the beginning of the process, not so much in the middle to the end, but was a conversation about reparations. I think that's a unique conversation because, for example, if reparations were afforded, right, in America, would Barack Obama be the recipient of reparation? With his mother's a white woman, and his father's from Africa, so he's not the descendant of slaves.
That comes up with the reparations argument. Yes,
exactly. So come up with Kamala Harris as well, because her father's from Jamaica, her mother's from so that doesn't fit.
Absolutely.
And it comes up with me. I was born in the United States Virgin Islands, but but when slavery was there, was run by the Danish. So where do I get my 40 acres and a mule? Okay, thank you, Dr. Phillips. Dr. Cooley, the floor is yours. And then from there, we go to Cierra Cross to ask questions.
Well, I think hypodescent is one of the is really the big thing here. And also who's doing the identification? So if you're self-identifying, you're going to view it a different way from if others are identifying you. And I agree with Dr. Phillips, it matters who it is, because each one has their framework, how they're viewing it from their own vision. But I can make it even more difficult. The fact that we have multiple characteristics, we have these intersectionalities, people don't maintain an even, steady race designation, an ethnicity designation. It depends on the situation. So I'll make it even harder. So if you're asking me about something in a particular situation, I might say, oh, I'm Irish, or I'm this, or I'm that. And that throws it all off too. So the census is asking, the lack of clarity in the questions is asking, and the people don't understand what in the contents are you asking. So Hispanic Americans, for example, have been putting other for a long time because they don't fit in how they view themselves. There have been instances in which, between two census, 2 times that the census was taken, there was a shift in race because people were identifying differently from how they identified first time. And I see Dr. Phillips has run across this too. And so I agree with her. This thing is unbelievably slippery. Now, why is it so important? Because one of the big ways of discrimination is, and I think this fits with what you were talking about, skin tone is one of the largest, most powerful ways we identify people. And the darker your skin tone, even within groups, often what people do is they say these individuals with darker skin tone are less valuable. And this is, so for my Irish, Black Irish are considered to be inferior to other Irish people. And so it does matter. The discrimination exists and is based on how people are viewing these individuals who look a particular way, and people stereotype them, and then they treat them, they put those barriers and automatic barriers in place. So we need to keep that for as long as that's still being done, so that you can measure how bad is the discrimination, how are the measures working, are they working in the appropriate way. Once that's done, and by the way, let's face it, this has been going on for how many, I think it's 1735, I said. So these classifications, you can't, we're what, 60 years out from the 60s. You're looking at 50 to 100 years before people sort of, because this is part of their basic ideas on how we interact with folks. And I would love to hear Dr. Phillips, if she's got a better estimate of when things are going to change. But I don't see this as a process that's going to be anytime soon.
No estimate here. No estimate here.
All right, Cierra?
But
Dr. Warren, Dr. Hodge, can I say one thing?
Sure, go ahead.
I just wanted to talk briefly just to clarify some terminologies that we use throughout this conversation. And one terminology that lay people use a lot is the Tuskegee Experiment. And coming from the Bioethics Center, I would be remiss not to clarify that it should be called the United States Public Health Service Syphilis Study at Tuskegee, Macon County, because when we just say the Tuskegee Experiment, it puts the responsibility and the genesis of it on the people at Tuskegee, where the genesis of it came from the United States government. And we need to always remember that what happened in Macon County was a direct effect of what the government chose to do, not the Black doctors there. And if we have time, I also have a question for Dr. Cooley, but later.
Cierra?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Michelle Kelly.
One of our first questions is for Dr. Phillips. What are we to say for the partners of the men in the Tuskegee study? Is there any information about the women, if they were given any treatment or sought for having the disease, and looked at for the outcome of how the disease affected their bodies?
Well, I have always read historically that the focus was on Black men. So I don't know of Black women being part of the study. What I do know is there, for what I've read, there is also history around the fact that that allowing the illness to progress was also part of medical history. So in some respects, that is an argument against it, the experiment being racialized. I read that, which I think is interesting. But given the number of men, almost 300, and given the length of time, for me, there's no racial logic around, even if that was part of the history of medicine, why a 40-year experiment focused on Black men and allowing for, as well as this lack of informed consent and the proposition that they were being treated for bad blood, why it wouldn't be racialized around Black male bodies. And so in my presentation I gave, it was a, I jumped historically, but I still kind of gave a little bit of a timeline of the more well-known and famous experimentations on Black bodies. So I did give Sims and the gynecological. I did not bring up Henrietta Lacks, but this kind of, the whole notion of informed consent comes out of the experimentation on Black bodies. So experimentation has happened on Black women and Black men, but my understanding, given all that I've read, I've never seen Black women being part of the study. But Dr. Hodge, can you?
Yeah, let me speak to that very quickly. I think the point that they were trying to make is that one of the kind of injustices and what makes it goes from famous to infamous is that it was 400 Black men, and then there were the control group would come up to about 623 Black men totally. And the issue was then becomes these Black men. I went to the National Archives and I read the literature, and these Black men had wives who had identical symptoms. So it is apparent that they were syphilitic. So,
Okay.
yeah, so now,
So
was
it was
there any?
passed on. Okay.
Right,
In
exactly. And
terms
then
of,
there's congenital syphilis, and other children are syphilitic. And
right.
so, and we met a brother the other day who is still syphilitic. He's going to be 90 years old next year. And so, how it's passed down, and it just doesn't seem to end. So, I think that's what she's trying to get to, that the women, they were not in the study,
Okay. Okay.
but they were the recipients of the tragedy of the study.
I got you.
Oh,
So have we essentially, the question is, we are focused on the men, but have we
It's on the women.
focused on the partners?
Right.
And so I guess the now that you've explained it, the answer is not so much. We have focused on the men, but not necessarily the partners, as well as the transmission to children.
And we can do a tracing, for those who are willing to take up the work to go to the archives, but it'll be an inductive tracing, not a deductive one. And that inductive tracing leads to probability and not certainty. Okay, next question, Cierra.
Our next question is for Dr. Phillips as well. As a former religion teacher at Florida Memorial University, I found that many Black students could not or would not categorize themselves as African American since they were not born in the US. So with that said, why and when did we go from being Negro, and is Negro now not a race anymore?
I think there are two questions in there, and I can't give a full answer to the question, to the two questions that I hear in there. But I think the question of how the Black students racial or ethnically identify. Essentially what you're saying is that you taught Black students who did not ethnically identify as African-American. So they must have, like I said, it was interesting that the 2020 census was not just about, are you Black or African-American, but what kind of Black are you? And given the opportunity to identify as ethnically. So are you Nigerian American? Are you Jamaican American? Are you Haitian American? Or if you identify as Black and Latino, which they have a category, what is it? It's non-Latin American or something like that, Black. And then if you're Black but Latino, you can identify in that way. So that's the way I would answer the question about why your students, and so clearly the population is heavily ethnic Blacks versus maybe historically what would be understood as African-American. What is interesting about your question about Negro is that it definitely, the ways in which Black people identify and specifically, maybe I would say African-Americans, is a result of racial identity and racial ideology, as well as the social forces, which is what I said, that impact race, political, economic, historical, that impact race. So when there was the movement from how the slave master identified enslaved Blacks as nigger, or initially enslaved Blacks were identified as Africans, and it wasn't for 4 to 5 generations, when really 4 to 5 generations of being in the US that they are identified as American. So there's always this kind of movement in terms of racial identification that, if we're looking at a theory of racial formation, cannot be talked about without this understanding of racial formation being both racial identity as well as racial ideology, and the fact that race is shaped by forces. And so, you know, African to, you know, Negro was 1960s, to Afro-American, to now African-American. And I think that I love what Cornel West says. So I identify as Black because, and he is technically African-American, but he chooses to identify as Black because he says, I identify as Black because I am identifying with the universal suffering as well as joys of Blackness throughout the diaspora. And so, so your question, I think, might be specific to a US context, because in a US context, US race matters. In the US, race matters. And because in the US context, race matters, which is not to say that throughout the world, race doesn't matter, but it displays or expresses itself in different ways. And so if you look at, I don't know if we can say a history, but in particular political and historic moments, African Americans have had different designations that is both a construction of how they identify themselves as well as how other people identify them. So now we're in African American. In a few years, it might be something different.
Okay, my next question is for both Dr. Phillips and Dr. Cooley. Would ethnicity remove the barriers that race constructs, for instance, like for the Arabs in your example?
Well,
I'll go second.
Okay. That, by the way, that helps me so I can answer and not feel as if I have to do really, really well to come after you. Let's be honest. The easiest thing people can do is to discriminate based on some sort of categorizing, putting people into categories. So unless you change human nature itself, any of these terms, any way we think about people, and instead of just being Homo sapiens with variations, the moment you talk about the variations, people will start putting values onto them. Male, female, cisgender, and so on. So, but what I think is important with ethnicity is its value for the individual who's using it, because it's how the person self-identifies. It's the person saying, this is who I am, this is how I want to be valued, and how they should be valued. And so I think that's extraordinarily powerful, and it enables people. As I said, with the race, when people we talk race, it's somebody else looking at you, and they have the power to classify you versus you taking the power and classifying yourself and saying, this is who I am. But I'll throw it over to Dr. Phillips.
I don't necessarily think ethnicity in any way takes away from or identifying oneself ethnically. Sociologists say so. Ethnicity is just another form or categorization for race, and so I don't know if there will ever be a movement away from race, whether we identify it as ethnicity or whether we identify it according to more phenotypic color. The other thing with ethnicity, and sociologist Patricia Hill Collins writes about this, but I like what she says with respect to ethnicity. Ethnicity is a celebration of being distinctive and unique, and that celebration should happen, but not without the recognition of and sometimes, so like now we are in the diversity, equity, and inclusion phase of America, and while I embrace that, which Patricia Hill Collins would embrace that because it is a celebration of our uniqueness and, you know, who we are. Ethnicity, that's what ethnicity does. But she cautions us about this celebration of diversity, equity, and inclusion to the exception of race and identifying the power dynamics that emerge around what happens when we talk about race and racialization. So when I talked about this allocation of differences, allocation of resources, political, economic, social, based on race and the inequities that emerge, that is the benefit of also identifying race, to talk about the suffering that can happen, or to talk about the inequities or inequalities and the marginalizations that can happen and do happen around race. Ethnicity has a way of, and we do that, of masking racial inequities. And Collins cautions us against using diversity, equity, and inclusion to mask racial inequities and inequalities. So my answer is we will get away from using, we'll get away from race and using ethnicity if we only focus on and celebrate our distinctiveness without really a true critical engagement and an analysis of racial inequities.
All right, thank you very much. We are out of come to the close. We're out of time, and we went over a little over time, but I didn't say much about that because we usually have 3 conversations, but today we had 2. That just gave us a little wiggle room, but I just wanted to say thank you. First to Ms. Cierra Cross, we thank you, our wonderful honor student, bioethics honor student, for her presentation, for how she conducted herself and how she presented. Thank you very much. She was a little nervous, but she is, but she gave us, and by the way, Cierra, I did pass your message on to Dr. O'Hara Rand to let her know that you are from the same city, and therefore you could that you could connect. One of Sierra's favorite things to do is to spend time with her mom and go shopping, and that along with her studies, she gave a scripture here that I thought it was so cool, because not everybody gives a scripture. Psalm 46 verse 5, God is in the midst of her, she will not be moved. God shall help her, and that right early. And so that is the scripture that typifies her life. And I just wanted to say that because the fact that she put it in there tells me that is an important part of the way she thinks about herself. God has given her favor to be the person that she is and to be the fighter that she is. Thank you very much, Cierra. I want to thank my brother and my sister, Dr. Cooley and Dr. Phillips. We're going to give you now a little 1 minute apiece right about that to kind of close it out before we go over to Dr. Warren to say our last words. We started powerfully and we ended just as powerfully. You have us so packed with information. If y'all could send me those slides, that would be helpful, because people are going to call and ask me for them. So if y'all could send me those PowerPoints, that would be so helpful. Then I'm going to use it outside of learning and class perhaps to help them out, but that will be really wonderful, because it's obvious that you put a whole lot of work into it. So Dr. Anywhere you want to go, Dr. Cooley, Dr. Phillips, and just give us your last words and anything else you want to add before we move forward.
Well, my last words really focus on my launching book board for launching pad for my presentation, which was Dr. Cooley's question, why does this matter? This matters because race matters. This matters because in the US race matters. And we are living, one of the triple pandemics is this racial state in which we live. And so we are dealing with US race matters, which has become global race matters. And so if we are thinking about the issue of the census and matters of the census, it cannot be thought about without the recognition of race mattering and the fact that in the US race matters, which shouldn't leave us downtrodden, because I ended on a positive note. In the ways in which a US racial state works, it is, there are despotic dimensions, but there are always, and counterbalancing that, democratic dimensions. And so if we the people are always cognizant of the despotic, then we the people have the power to resist and to change the despotic for the purposes of democracy. I have in a half an hour another event that I am co-hosting, and so I should be on that call right now. So I thank everyone, Dr. Warren and Dr. Hodge and Dr. Cooley and Mr. Davis and Miss Griffins and Dr. Bailey and Miss Cross for inviting me and hosting me. And I'm going to sign off right now, but thank you again.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
I have to say that every time I encounter Dr. Warren and Dr. Hodge, I learn something more. I'm a little bit smarter, because it takes a long time for me to learn. So I'm a little bit smarter. And as they know, one of my big projects is learning the language of diversity and inclusion. That part of how we do that is to make our interactions normal. That is, we become fluent in understanding each other, although I agree with Dr. Hodge that a lot of times we can't know, but at least we can understand. Right. And then we use that as a way of being fluent in discussing these matters. And we had a talk at the Northern Plains Ethics Institute with Justice Page, who was a Minnesota Supreme Court justice and a Black man. And he said that when he grew up in the 60s, it's much different from the 60s. I don't think it's good, but it's better. And I'm hoping that his view that it's going to get better as we learn this language is absolutely right. So I want to thank Dr. Warren, Dr. Hodge, Ms. Cross, Mr. Davis, Ms. Griffins, for all of the work you did with me, especially Mr. Davis, Ms. Griffins, because I am computer illiterate. But I want to throw this back to, because I know we're over time, so I'll end there. But thank you very much for including me on such an important occasion.
Thank you. Somebody, yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Dennis. We really appreciate that. We really appreciate this conversation and letting us, giving us so much information, because the census matters. Those of us, because so many people are still afraid of the census, because the census is being used to harm, but properly used, it could use to help and to aid. So we appreciate that. So we've come down to the end of our journey, but not the total end, because tomorrow we have our banquet and we have our backup speaker, and we also have our young people at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time with Brother Sonny Etienne speaking to our bioethics students, as well as other students that we've invited. We also invited the new bridge builder students to participate, to send messages to them. Cierra, talk to your fellows, to your comrades, and remind them of tomorrow, because that is majorly important. Sonny Etienne spoke last year, and he was riveting. And I got to tell you, he was my student at Florida Memorial University, and as a student, he was riveting then. So he has not diminished at all. We want to thank Dr. Ashanti. We want to thank Ashanti Ali Davis for him being a technical person, and he was brought in for such a time as this. He's the one who's going to navigate, negotiate the YouTube and the Facebook that's going to take this to another level where people around the world can use this as an education tool. Because so long as these conversations just stay in one place, they don't go anywhere. They just kind of sit on the shelf. But now we have access to take it around the world, and people could use it as a tool for conversation and enlightenment. And like you said, then it's a normalization of conversation. So we really appreciate that. Now we want to thank Ms. Griffin, because everything posted on the website, she's the poster. And she's always on, making sure that things, if something slips to the right or to the left, that we catch it. So I am so excited that this part of it is over, because this was my part. This was my under my leadership. This part is over. The only glitch we had was one with Dr. Gail Boland, and we fixed it quickly. So I'm so glad that it was as seamless as it has been. So I appreciate everybody, Ms. Geraldine Thomas, Ms. Keisha Stewart, Miss Dr. Ebo, and she's doing her part on Monday and Friday. That's her time. Vantries Hurd, Robin White, all of these people who come together, even Avia Sutton, all these people who come together and do their part, because that's what makes a team. If I hit a home, if I'm playing for the New York Yankees, I'm Derek Jeter, and I hit a home run, nobody complains on the team. Every time one person hits a home run for the team, everybody hits a home run. Now, I said those are my final words. I give it now to our fearless sage, seer, Dr. Reuben Warren, the man that God, the prophet that God has given us to lead this opportunity. And last year we sat down and we came up with this topic about vulnerability and ethics and the U.S. Constitution. And then we're going to sit there. He already gave me that. I'm not going to tell you all, but he already gave me a thought for the next year. But I'm going to tell you, we've already seen some smidgens of it already. So Dr. Warren, we just put it in your hands now to give us the last words, and however you want to close us out, and then we will say farewell.
I'm going to be quick because it's been a long but very exciting time. Dr. Hodge has structured this and taken us from a fear of not being able to get together to a reality of doing more than we ever thought we can do. So I want to thank him. He struggles through not doing, and we talked in the night or in the morning about how he will not be able to participate the next day, but it never stops. So he's going to participate. So what we have to do is again thank him very, very much for his work. Two things that I want to say in closing. One, I said in the chat box, and I'm learning how to use this electronic stuff, but there's an important book on caste by Isabella Wilkerson, and she really unpacks race and caste and class in a very wonderful way. A couple of things I did not hear in our conversation as we talked about race. I did not hear the word racism, because that's in fact where we need to go, and we can address that in that way. Another thing is that the notion of what happened to Floyd, his murder, allowed the world to see how racism impacts in the United States, and then they saw the same thing where they are. So I think this has been a global experience for all of us. Dr. Hodge thanked all the folks who have been doing this work. I have to take a moment and give Ashanti Ali Davis much praise. He is our MPH student from Tuskegee. He just graduated. So it lets you know the kind of work that we're doing at Tuskegee. Let me encourage you to join us tomorrow, because really the reason we're here is to honor the men who were in the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee. And this tomorrow, it's usually a banquet, but it's a virtual banquet tomorrow. And you'll hear the work that we're doing to tell the truth about the men who were in that study. So again, let me close by saying thank you. And the work was powerful. And with God's help, we'll see this work in our journal. That's our goal, to make what we say translate into what we write and what we share with the world. So again, thank you so very much. And Dr. Cooley, you will not get away from us. You're part of it now. So if you don't come, we're going to come get you. So that's what it's going to be from now on. So again, Dr. Hodge, thank you again, and for everybody who's been participating. And again, let me say, I can't stop talking about our students. The goal of a teacher is for the student to become the teacher. And I've become a student to many of those young folk who were managing this thing today with Dr. Hodge. Thank you for their leadership as well.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Autumn Brownfield was the first person who led today, so we thank her. We thank President Jalen Spain of the Bioethics Honors Program because he just continues to stay motivated and keep pushing and pushing and pushing, so we thank him. And so as we come to a close, tomorrow at the virtual banquet won't be virtual for me because I'm a quasi-vegan. Somebody, so that's the other. I'm a quasi-vegan. Somebody said, "Wait a minute, that means you eat everything." I know it doesn't mean I eat everything. It means I eat anything. See, there's a difference between eating. I don't eat frog legs, but I would eat whatever I want. So in the banquet, I will be eating some things. So I say to you, farewell, assalamu alaikum, shalom, peace, and blessings upon you. Take care, everybody.